Hello and welcome back to the Infinite Text. My name is Patrick and today we're going to talk about dungeons and lairs. We're going to define the two, then we're going to compare them using a couple of categories, and then we're going to try and come up with a couple of rules of thumb to say if a location is a dungeon, a lair, or both at the same time. So for a definition, I asked Merriam-Webster and ChatGPT, and Merriam-Webster said that a dungeon is a dark and usually underground prison or vault, and a lair is the resting or living place of a wild animal, a refuge or place for hiding. And ChatGPT said that a dungeon is a strong underground prison or chamber historically used to detain prisoners, often found in castles or fortifications. And a lair is a secluded or hidden dwelling where an animal or person lives, often associated with wild animals' dens or secret hideouts. And it's important here that we keep in mind that a lair is a place where someone lives, where a creature lives, where a person lives. It's not just a place where they hang out, but it's their living space. They have their stuff there, their like belongings, treasure, whatever. So now that we have definitions for these two terms, let's start comparing them. And I came up with 3 categories, and the first one is usage. A dungeon is used for a specific purpose, like detaining prisoners, a magical place, or a religious place like a shrine or temple, and it's also planned and constructed with this purpose in mind. A lair, as we already said, is a resting place, a safe place for a creature, for a community of creatures, and then if we go back to the original meaning of the word lair, which is bed or resting place, then we can say that a lair is a safe space for a community of creatures, or one creature, if it's large enough, where they have their main living space, their the main part of their possessions, in brackets treasure, and this also has implications on where the lair is built and how it is laid out and constructed. If it is constructed at all, because in the next point we will see where lairs actually come from. So let's talk about where dungeons and lairs actually come from. Dungeons are usually man-made or sentient creature-made, like dwarves, drow, gnomes, whatever. But they can also be natural occurrences like caves, and then extended by a sentient creature like dwarves, for example. They go into a cave and they extend the cave with rooms and deep halls, like dwarves usually do, and then a cave becomes a dungeon, so to speak. Lairs, we should separate that into 3 different categories, or into 3 different points, so to speak, because they can be created by natural processes like caves or mountain regions, forests. They can be constructed to serve the purpose of a lair, for example, a fire giant's castle near a volcano or a house where humans live. And they can be constructed for a different purpose and then later be repurposed to be a lair. For example, we have a prison which has been abandoned for 50 years now, and all of a sudden, like goblins move into that prison and make their lair there. So layout and contents of dungeons are usually a bit different, but they have definitely areas where they overlap. A dungeon can really be anything. It can be a wizard's tower, an old prison, an old abandoned ruined collapsed shrine. It's usually made by an intelligent creature and artificially. So a prison is, for example, built into the ground. They have to dig out soil and build a prison there. Or it's built under a castle, for example. Dungeons range from small locations with just a couple of rooms and maybe just one level to huge megalomaniac complexes with like 10, 15 or even more levels and hundreds of rooms. And they usually contain traps, empty rooms, puzzles, and wandering monsters. And also special rooms where you have treasure or maybe something that the creature that is living in that dungeon or that is housed in that dungeon has. So, for example, what could that be? A room where goblins have a couple of rats they are holding as either food or cannon fodder they can send into combat if they're getting attacked. The layout and the structure are usually determined by the purpose the dungeon serves. So, a prison would have many loops and confusing passages to make escape harder. Each level of a wizard tower would serve a different purpose of the wizard's daily life, and for example a mine of dwarves would have long winding tunnels and large rooms and deep rooms where the mineral deposits have been. For lairs, the content and especially the layout are depending on how the lair came to be, how it was created. If it is a wilderness lair, then it was created by natural processes, and therefore the layout will be rather chaotic and there will be no clear structure. If you have a constructed lair, like for example a castle, they would be rather similar to dungeons with a main difference, and that would be that traps and things that make traversing and entering the lair harder would only be on the outer rings of the lair, and in the middle where the community actually lives, you usually don't find traps or puzzles or dangerous things, because it would make traversing the lair very dangerous and also very time consuming, because you would need to walk on certain paths to not step into traps by accident. And for the layouts and contents of an old dungeon that was repurposed as a lair, you would just have the same principles as for a normal dungeon, so to speak. So there would be traps, puzzles, riddles, wandering monsters, and then a community of creatures who lives there, whoever that is, goblins, orcs, whatever. And just to give a couple of examples for lairs, for example, spiders, if they move into a cave, they choose a cave which has a lot of like dark spots and corners where they can ambush their prey, while spiders in the forest would turn a part of the forest into a, let's say, tangled maze of webs and branches where they can quickly traverse and trap their prey. Goblins would usually use a abandoned cave or an abandoned underground complex and refit this to serve their purposes. Gnomes would extend a cave and dig deeper into the mountains, digging larger rooms and passageways. And dwarves would, for example, use a cave by making rooms and building grand architecture with shaped stones into the cave, or extend the cave so they can make their underground lair, underground complex there. So before we come to a conclusion, I want to compare dungeons and lairs at one more point, and that would be number of inhabitants. So if you look at old D&D versions and also, for example, old school essentials, you will see that one statistic in a monster stat block is number appearing. And there are 4 different values in OSE, for example. You'd have monsters appearing as wandering monsters in a dungeon. You have monsters in a dungeon lair. You have wandering monsters in the wilderness and monsters in the wilderness lair. And the 2 numbers we want to look at are monsters in a dungeon lair and monsters in the wilderness lair. So if we look, for example, at goblins in their dungeon lair, they will be encountered at 60-10. So we have either 6 or 60 of them, minimum, maximum. And in their wilderness lair, they will be encountered at 60-10 times 5. So we have a minimum of 30 and a maximum of 300 of them. Is that fair? Yes, because in a dungeon, you have all the other stuff too. You have traps, puzzles, riddles, dangerous passages, wandering monsters. So to somewhat balance that out, you have less monsters of that type that has their lair there, while in a wilderness lair, you will usually not see many traps, because you know they have their children there as well. They have their females there as well, which usually don't fight. You don't have traps, no puzzles, and if you have them, only on the outer rims. So you can say that there will be more creatures of them, more potential combatants, but less dangerous, let's say, environmental effects like traps, puzzles, dangerous tricks, whatever. Because no sane creature would put traps and dangerous passages and puzzles into into the middle of their living space where their females and young live. There are some creatures that are like the exception to the rule here. For example, a lich, which's lair would be riddled with traps and dangerous halls and puzzles, because they can control their lair and they can just traverse their lair without triggering the traps. So how do we decide if a location is a lair, a dungeon, or both? I think using the things we just talked about, we can build a few rules of thumb. And if we want to decide if a lair is also a dungeon, then we could say it is one if it contains the elements of a dungeon. So empty rooms, traps, puzzles, wandering monsters, treasure, usually artificially made by a sentient race, and the other way around. When is a dungeon a lair? I would say if at least one community of creatures lives inside the dungeons. And in large locations like mega dungeons, there could be multiple communities of creatures. Like you could have on the first 2 levels, you could have orcs. On the 4th and 5th level, you could have hobgoblins. On the 6th and 7th level, you could have a spider infestation. So I think this is like the best rule to decide if a dungeon is also a lair, to just see if someone is living there, then it's their lair, and then you will use like the numbers for a dungeon lair to determine how many creatures of this community are there. And there is one more help to decide if a location is a dungeon or a lair, and that would be the monster descriptions in your monster manual, monster book of choice. Because many of them will probably contain short passages about where a creature lives. For example, a goblin usually lives underground, while griffins make their lair close to grasslands where they can prey on horses and other larger grassland creatures. And before we end this episode, I want to give a quick summary and say a couple of closing words about this topic. Eventually, it is upon you, the GM, to decide if a location is a dungeon lair or both. Nothing holds you back to say it's a dungeon lair without traps, or it's a wilderness lair with many traps. It's your decision. In both cases, though, the descriptions, mood, look, and feel should reflect the current status of the location. So if goblins moved into an old prison, they will have changed that. If spiders took up their lair in a, let's say, 10-room cave, then you will have webs and entanglements everywhere. What I always say to everyone is, don't shy away from shaking things up a bit. You know, there could be goblins living in a forest, because maybe they have been driven out of their cave by umber hulks and they need help now to get back into their cave. People from a forest, halflings, could have been driven underground because maybe their forest was taken over by, I don't know, owlbears. Well, that's owlbears maybe, or any other creature that would take over a part of a forest. Most things can be explained, but not everything has to be plausible. It's fantasy after all, right? And with this, I want to end this video and thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then press the like button and subscribe to the channel, and I would say see you next time at the Infinite X. Bye bye!